Welcome to It's Only Up From Here, a space to revel in the alchemy of transformation, a space to be a nudging light at the end of the tunnel, a space to remind you you've been your own hero all along. This is Lauren, your host of It's Only Up From Here. Hey guys. From me and my radiator, because it's November, it's cold, and I live in a New York City apartment. Every time I record a podcast episode, I feel like I'm trying to make fetch happen. Shout out to Gretchen Wieners, if you know, you know. I was thinking the other day of how being an artist is constantly embarrassing yourself a little bit. Like you're constantly putting yourself out there, posting your art into the ether, and sometimes there can be this fear of being perceived or quote unquote too seen. I've been thinking about that lately as an artist, that you're constantly trying to make fetch happen. Literally. You're constantly putting yourself out there. It's constantly embarrassing yourself. But honestly, sometimes you have to be a little delusional in the state of the world today. You have to be delusional in your dreams, in your hopes, in your aspirations, in your art. I was born creating, but it's weird how doing something new can make you feel like a novice in something you've been doing all your life. For example, I'm a writer, and I've been writing short stories and poems since I was 9 years old. But because this is my first time at 30, trying to really put my art out there, like putting my writing and my art on a podcast or going to open mics in New York City, I feel somewhat like a novice. In my last episode, I was talking a lot about creative block and how we sometimes envy the output of other artists without seeing the countless hours and grind that they put into their work. I think it's also important to be real with yourself about how much work you want to put into publicizing your work. For example, sometimes I see writers online who I don't necessarily jive with their work or think it's that great, but they are constantly promoting, posting, and publishing their work. So it doesn't mean necessarily that they're more talented or less talented than the next person, but they put work into promoting their shit. And I'm going to be honest, sometimes I don't feel like promoting my shit. It feels too businessy. It feels too much like a machine. I had a family member the other day pushing me to put my podcast on a video platform. And while I think that would be essential for my podcast traction and growth, I don't know. I think I'm tired. I don't know if it's that I'm unmotivated or if it's more I'm tired of, the grind. With the rise of social media, I feel like there's always this grind to promote your art on there and sell yourself in a way. And I don't think that's a bad thing because selling yourself brings people deals and promotions and financial security, amongst other accolades. It's great if you have that inherent grind in you to push your art, but sometimes I often struggle with that. I've mentioned before I work on a corporate podcast, and that's obviously a huge part of the job, pushing for growth. That at the end of the workday, I struggle to want to do that for my own art. It's something I do aspire to be better at, but I never want it to feel like a chore. I've heard of the term artrepreneur, play off the word entrepreneur, and my God, I cannot. I know at my core that's not who I am. I'm not an entrepreneur, or anything of the sort. And maybe that means my art doesn't take off the way that would be nice, But I don't know if I want or have that in me. I think a lot about certain artists that I love, like D'Angelo, rest his soul, or Lauryn Hill. D'Angelo, a phenomenal musician, had a 14-year gap between his second and last album. He wasn't trying to be a machine or churn out an album every few years for the sake of it. But I'm sure that doesn't mean he wasn't writing, creating, and performing in between that time. But it's almost like he was never trying to stay relevant. He just was off of the sheer talent of his artistry. And Black Messiah, his last album in 2014, I remember I was 19 in my freshman year of college when that album dropped. And I was absolutely mesmerized by the songs on this album. They were so beautiful, and the songs seemed to transcend time and space, and they were so ethereal. It was just this beautiful body of work. I missed out on D'Angelo's first two albums, only being an infant and 5 years old when they first came out. And while I grew up knowing his songs and loving tracks like Brown Sugar and Me and Those Dreaming Eyes of Mine, I wasn't there when they first dropped and the buzz around them. So being a fully conscious realized young adult for the Drop of Black Messiah was so beautiful. I remember that album feeling like an experience. And Lauryn Hill, to my very point of not being a machine, she dropped her only solo album, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, in 98 and has still been performing it ever since. Like, I love that about her. I love that she still performs her old shit and like that's all that she needs to perform because it's beautiful. It's timeless. Like Lauryn Hill's music is timeless to me. And from this Complex article that came out in 2023, I gathered it was more of a complicated reason around why Lauryn never put out another album after The Miseducation. But she still is one of the most talented songwriters and artists to me in spite of anything she has not put out. And yeah, I know Miss Hill's reputation of showing up late as hell to her shows. It's funny, I was listening to a podcast episode one time of The Friend Zone, and one of the hosts, Dustin, was talking about how he went to a Lauryn Hill show, and he was hella late to the show, but essentially got there on time because Lauryn Hill was so late. That actually cracked me up, but I know there's sometimes a complicated relationship with fans because of it. But her music and her artistry is so beautiful nonetheless, so inspiring, so poetic. Hell, if I ever got tickets to a Lauryn Hill concert, I'm gonna be honest, I'd still go on a hope and a prayer. But I say all of this to say these are two artists and creatives that they weren't constantly churning out their art in a mass hall every year for the public to witness and enjoy. They were and are showing up their authentic selves, and their work touches the souls of so many. And I know someone could hear this and think, well, obviously they were doing something right with pushing their art because they are and were famous, but it's not even about that. I just am trying to find the right balance of that, creating my art for me. And even if that means every time I go to an open mic, I perform the same poems on repeat that I've performed before, at least I'm showing up. There's someone that could be touched every time by your work. And there's someone that's always hearing or discovering your work for the very first time. So there's someone that could be touched every time, much like I was touched by the music of a couple of the artists I mentioned. Some of my favorite artists I've loved, whether that's writers, painters, poets, musicians, screenwriters, etc., I've simply only consumed maybe one small portion of their art. And that was enough to have respected and enjoyed them as an artist. Like, you don't have to constantly churn out art to be an artist or to be quote unquote official. If someone sees you as lesser of a creative because of the quantity of art put out, fuck them. Simply put, fuck them. They're not doing what you're doing anyway. You know, it's a good reminder to keep that in your headspace. In my last episode, I talked about if you truly love what you're doing, there's always a seat at the table for you. At least I believe so. And I think that if you create one thing or 100 things, there's a space for you that your art is welcome and appreciated in. Lately, I've been feeling a sense of ennui during the work week. Just this long, drawn-out listlessness and lack of excitement. And it's admittedly been really hard to manage at times, too. I'm often uninspired when it comes to my actual day job, and sometimes I don't know the workaround for that, really, but I'm taking it one day at a time. I've been mainly trying to work through that by taking moments during the week to still dedicate and allocate time to reading one of my favorite books or a new one, or writing a poem, or working on this series that's only up from here. I'm currently rereading The Awakening by Kate Chopin, one of my favorite novels ever. I wrote a paper on it back in college, actually. Whenever I feel like I'm drowning in the lackluster humdrum of everyday life and need to feel something, it's one of the reads I go back to. So I've been trying to consume the art that makes me feel something, that breaks me out of the humdrum in order to pull myself from this listlessness, this ennui that I've been feeling. Even if that means rereading the same book or replaying the same song, I found that it helps some. And it kind of goes back to the point of, Lauryn Hill performing her same songs on stage that she's been performing since the 90s with The Miseducation. Art is always going to touch someone. Your art, no matter how often they read it or don't read it, or no matter how often you perform it on stage, it's always going to resonate with someone. There's always someone who's discovering something new about your art. And I think that embodies what I'm, trying to talk about today. You don't have to constantly be a machine. And I don't have all the answers for promoting your work because I don't really promote my work as much as I should, but I go to open mics in the city. I love doing spoken word on stage. And I do very often perform a lot of the poems that I've performed time and time again. I perform poems that I've written in college or in my time before moving to New York City or in my time when I first moved to New York City. But I think that's okay. You're an artist. You're not a machine. You don't have to constantly churn stuff out. Like, you can create something and play off that same thing for years if you want to. Look at all these phenomenal musicians we listen to. You play their song on repeat. You read that same author because you just love their work so much. And I think that's the very core of being an artist, is that you can't be worried about trying to make fetch happen. You can't be worried about having an assembly line of work. If you only create one thing once a year, you're still just as valid. And that's okay. Play around with it is some advice I'd probably have, is play around with that one thing you created. See how you can perform it differently. If you're a writer, if you're a poet and you've written one great poem and you feel like you're always performing that same poem, see how you can perform it differently. But it still matters. It's still meaningful. That's advice I'd give to myself and others. If you're a musician, see how you can play the song differently. See how you can perform it differently with any piece of work. Think about how you can expand on that. If you're a painter and feel like you've only painted this one great piece, think about how you can expand on that piece. I used to feel, a little shy about recycling and reperforming the same poems that I've always performed at spoken words or at open mics. But the older I get, I realize that doesn't even matter, because if I connect with one person in the audience, I've done my job as an artist. I recently, a couple of months ago, performed at an artist showcase put on by IYKYK. My former coworker, shout out to her, I texted her that day asking about the event because I was interested in going to the event. And she let me know last minute they had a poet drop out and asked me at 2 p.m. if I wanted to perform that night. And I said, you know what? What the hell? Sure. It turned out to be a beautiful night. I performed 3 poems that I've been performing for years that I wrote back in college. But I'm like, it was so beautiful and it was such a meaningful and inspiring night seeing other artists and poets. I got to connect with so many people. People came up to me at the end and told me how they related to the poem or how my work inspired them or touched them. And I'm like, that's what it's all about. It's not about being a machine. It's not about, succumbing to this capitalist narrative of you have to be productive. You have to put out a new piece of art every week or keep going. And I think that's sometimes why I don't even record my podcast 24/7. I'm being realistic with myself and my capabilities. But I know I owe it to myself to dedicate more time to this. So here's to being an artist. Here's to doing your best as an artist. And here's to being authentic as the artist you are. Whether that's one piece of art you create a year or every other year, or you create art every single day. Here's to living your authentic self as an artist. Here's to being your authentic self and living in your truth as an artist. The poem I want to read today, I don't remember when I wrote this poem. It was sometime between 20 and 30. It's a little elementary, I'll admit. But I don't know, it's still a nice poem. It was me writing authentically in the moment about how I feel about poetry and writing. And this poem, I titled it Superpower. There for me at every heartache, a storm roaring out of my mind and onto pages. Where would I be without such an escape? You were my way of screaming to the top of my lungs, my way of letting loose, of being free. You were my superpower like no other. Where would I be if I didn't have you? My thoughts, like monsters in the night, would have eaten me alive. But you, my knight in glistening armor, battle them all for me. Your brawny arms lift me up high in the moments where I should be lowest. You are what I turn to when no one else is around. Perhaps it is just me talking to myself in the abyss of these pages, but you make me fearless. Oh, poetry, you make me strong. I encourage you, listener, to find what makes you strong. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like what you heard, take a moment to follow this podcast on your favorite listening platform. If you want to connect with me, give me a follow at It's Only Up From Here podcast on Instagram or TikTok, or shoot me an email at itsonlyupfromherepod@gmail.com. This is Lauren, your host of It's Only Up From Here.